They thought they could silence me with a pink slip and a fake smile. They thought wrong. What started as the happiest moment of my life turned into a nightmare that would cost them everything. But sometimes, the sweetest revenge comes wrapped in justice. I never imagined that sharing the news of my pregnancy would end my career at Morrison & Associates within 48 hours. My name is Jessica Turner, and this is the story of how I turned my wrongful termination into their worst nightmare. It was a Tuesday morning in March when I decided to tell my supervisor about my pregnancy. I was 12 weeks along, past the point where most women feel comfortable sharing the news. I'd been working at Morrison & Associates, a mid-sized consulting firm, for 3 years. I was good at my job, excellent even. My performance reviews were consistently outstanding, and I had recently been promoted to senior analyst. I knocked on my supervisor's door that morning, my heart racing with excitement. David Morrison, the company's founder and CEO, was reviewing quarterly reports when I entered his corner office. The man was in his early 50s, with graying hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He had always treated me fairly, or so I thought. "Jessica, come in. What can I do for you?" he asked, not looking up from his paperwork. "I wanted to share some personal news with you," I began, my voice filled with barely contained joy. "I'm pregnant. I'm due in October." The silence that followed was deafening. David slowly raised his eyes from his papers, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might congratulate me. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and studied me with a look I had never seen before. "I see," he said finally. "How far along are you?" 12 weeks, I replied, suddenly feeling uncomfortable under his scrutiny. "And you're planning to take maternity leave, I assume?" "Yes, of course. I was hoping we could discuss the details and perhaps work out a plan for covering my responsibilities while I'm away." David nodded slowly, his fingers drumming on his desk. "We'll need to discuss this further. Let me review our policies and get back to you." I left his office feeling uneasy, but I pushed the feeling aside. This was supposed to be a happy time, and I refused to let workplace concerns overshadow my joy. I went back to my desk and threw myself into my work, hoping that David's odd reaction was just surprise. 2 days later, I was called into a meeting with David and Patricia Wells, the head of human resources. Patricia was a woman in her 40s with a stern demeanor and a reputation for being ruthless when it came to company policies. She sat across from me with a folder in her hands and a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Jessica, thank you for coming in," Patricia began. "We've been reviewing your position and the company's current needs." My stomach dropped. I knew what was coming before she said another word. "Unfortunately, we're going to have to let you go. The company is restructuring, and we're eliminating several positions, including yours." I stared at them in disbelief. "You're firing me? 2 days after I told you I was pregnant?" "This has nothing to do with your pregnancy," David said quickly. "This is purely a business decision." "A business decision that coincidentally happens 2 days after I announced my pregnancy?" I could hear my voice rising, but I couldn't control it. "You just promoted me 6 months ago. My performance reviews are exemplary. How can you possibly justify this?" Patricia slid a document across the table. "Here's your termination agreement. You'll receive 2 weeks severance pay and continued health insurance for 30 days. We'll also provide a positive reference for future employment." I looked at the document without picking it up. "This is discrimination. You can't fire me for being pregnant." "We're not firing you for being pregnant," Patricia repeated. "We're eliminating your position due to restructuring." "Then show me the restructuring plan. Show me the documentation that proves this decision was made before I told you about my pregnancy." David and Patricia exchanged glances. "I'm afraid that information is confidential," David said. I stood up, my hands shaking with rage. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer." "Jessica, please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be," Patricia said. "Take the severance package and move on. Fighting this will only hurt your reputation in the industry." I walked out of that meeting feeling like I had been punched in the gut. The life I had built at Morrison & Associates was crumbling around me, and all because I was going to have a baby. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing with questions and fears. That evening, I called my husband, Michael, who was traveling for work. When I told him what had happened, he was furious. "They can't do this to you," he said. "This is exactly the kind of discrimination that pregnancy laws are designed to prevent." "But they're claiming it's a restructuring," I said, my voice breaking. "They have documentation. They have their story straight." "Then we'll prove they're lying. We'll get a lawyer and fight this." I spent the weekend researching employment attorneys in our area. I needed someone who specialized in discrimination cases, someone who would take my case seriously. I found Catherine Walsh, a partner at a prestigious law firm who had built her career on fighting workplace discrimination. Catherine's office was in a gleaming downtown tower, and she met me on a Monday morning exactly 1 week after my termination. She was a woman in her early 40s with shoulder-length auburn hair and sharp green eyes that reminded me of a predator sizing up its prey. "Tell me everything," she said, settling behind her desk with a legal pad. I recounted the entire story, from my pregnancy announcement to my termination. Catherine took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me. "This is a classic case of pregnancy discrimination," she said. "The timing is too convenient to be coincidental. The question is whether we can prove it. How do we do that? We start by examining their restructuring claims. If they're lying about eliminating your position, we'll find evidence of it. We'll also look at their treatment of other pregnant employees and new mothers. Patterns of discrimination are often the key to winning these cases." Catherine explained that she would work on a contingency basis, meaning she would only get paid if we won the case. This was a relief, as Michael and I didn't have the money for expensive legal fees while I was unemployed and pregnant. "I need to warn you," Catherine said as our meeting concluded. "This won't be easy. They'll fight back, and they'll try to discredit you. They'll claim you were a poor employee, that you were going to be terminated anyway. They'll make this as uncomfortable as possible, hoping you'll drop the case." "I'm not dropping anything," I said firmly. "They destroyed my career because I'm having a baby. I won't let them get away with it." Catherine smiled for the first time since I had met her. "Good. That's exactly what I wanted to hear." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal activity. Catherine filed a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the first step in pursuing a federal discrimination lawsuit. She also began the discovery process, demanding documents from Morrison & Associates related to my termination and their alleged restructuring. The company's response was swift and predictable. They hired a high-powered defense firm and began what could only be described as a campaign of character assassination. They claimed I had been underperforming, that I was difficult to work with, that my termination had been planned for months. But Catherine was ready for their tactics. She had subpoenaed my personnel files, including my performance reviews and promotion records. The documentation painted a very different picture than the one Morrison & Associates was trying to create. "Look at this," Catherine said during one of our meetings, spreading my employment records across her conference table. 3 years of excellent performance reviews, a promotion just 6 months ago, a salary increase, bonus payments. If they were planning to fire you, they have a funny way of showing it. The real breakthrough came when Catherine's investigators discovered that Morrison & Associates had hired someone to replace me just 2 weeks after my termination. The new hire was a recent college graduate with no experience, and she was being paid significantly less than my salary had been. "This is exactly what we needed," Catherine said, her voice filled with satisfaction. "If they were truly eliminating your position, they wouldn't have replaced you. And certainly not with someone who lacks your qualifications." But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. One of my former colleagues, Maria Santos, reached out to me through a mutual friend. Maria had been at Morrison & Associates for 5 years, and she had witnessed something that would change everything. "I overheard David and Patricia talking the day after you told him about your pregnancy," Maria told me during a clandestine meeting at a coffee shop across town. "David was furious. He said they couldn't afford to have you out on maternity leave during their busiest season. Patricia suggested they find a way to get rid of you before you could claim any benefits." Maria was terrified of retaliation. but she agreed to provide a sworn statement detailing what she had heard. Her testimony was the smoking gun we needed to prove that my termination was directly related to my pregnancy. Catherine was ecstatic. "This is it," she said. "This is the evidence that will break their case wide open." The lawsuit was filed in federal court 6 months after my termination. The complaint alleged pregnancy discrimination, wrongful termination, and retaliation. We sought damages for lost wages, emotional distress, and punitive damages designed to punish Morrison and Associates for their illegal conduct. The media picked up the story almost immediately. Local news stations ran features on workplace discrimination, and my case became a symbol of the ongoing fight for women's rights in the workplace. The attention was overwhelming, but it also brought support from unexpected places. Other women came forward with their own stories of discrimination at Morrison and Associates. Catherine was contacted by 3 former employees who had been terminated or demoted after announcing pregnancies or requesting family leave. Their testimonies painted a picture of a company with a systemic problem when it came to treating pregnant employees fairly. "This is bigger than just your case now," Catherine told me. "We're looking at a pattern of discrimination that goes back years. This could be a class action lawsuit." The pressure on Morrison and Associates was mounting. Their stock price began to suffer as investors worried about the potential financial impact of a major discrimination lawsuit. Industry publications ran articles questioning the company's corporate culture and management practices. David Morrison tried to control the narrative by giving interviews to business magazines, claiming that the lawsuit was baseless and that the company had always treated employees fairly. But his words rang hollow in light of the mounting evidence against them. The deposition phase of the lawsuit was particularly satisfying. Catherine grilled David and Patricia for hours, forcing them to confront their own contradictions and lies. David's calm demeanor cracked under the pressure, and he became defensive and evasive when confronted with evidence of his company's discriminatory practices. "You testified that Ms. Turner's position was eliminated due to restructuring," Catherine said during David's deposition. "But isn't it true that you hired someone to replace her just 2 weeks after her termination?" "We hired someone for a different position," David replied, his voice strained. "A different position that involved the exact same responsibilities and reported to the same supervisor?" "The duties were similar, but the position was different." "Similar enough that you used Ms. Turner's job description when posting the vacancy?" David's attorney objected. But the damage was done. The transcript of his deposition would be devastating evidence at trial. Patricia's deposition was even more damaging. She was forced to admit that the company had no written restructuring plan and that the decision to eliminate my position was made hastily without any formal analysis of the business impact. "When did you first discuss eliminating Ms. Turner's position?" Catherine asked. "I don't recall the exact date," Patricia replied. "Was it before or after she announced her pregnancy?" "I'm not sure." Catherine produced a calendar. Ms. Turner announced her pregnancy on March 15th. She was terminated on March 17th. Are you telling me that the decision to eliminate her position was made, documented, and approved in less than 48 hours? Patricia's silence spoke volumes. As the case progressed, the financial pressure on Morrison and Associates intensified. The cost of defending the lawsuit was enormous, and the negative publicity was driving away clients. Several major contracts were canceled, and the company's reputation in the industry was in tatters. Catherine received a call from their defense attorney 6 months before the trial was scheduled to begin. They wanted to discuss settlement. "They're scared," Catherine told me. "They know they're going to lose, and they're trying to minimize the damage." The first settlement offer was insulting. They offered to reinstate me with back pay and a modest financial settlement. Catherine rejected it immediately. "They destroyed your career and put you through hell," she said. "They're going to pay for what they did." The offers kept coming, each one larger than the last. But Catherine was holding out for something bigger. She wanted them to admit wrongdoing and agree to policy changes that would prevent this from happening to other women. "This isn't just about money," she explained. "This is about sending a message that pregnancy discrimination won't be tolerated." The breakthrough came when one of Morrison and Associates' major clients threatened to terminate their contract if the lawsuit wasn't resolved quickly. The client was a progressive technology company that didn't want to be associated with a firm accused of discrimination. Catherine's phone rang on a Friday afternoon in November. Morrison and Associates was ready to settle for a significant sum and would agree to our terms regarding policy changes and public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The settlement was more than I had ever imagined possible. The financial compensation would allow me to take time off after my baby was born and still maintain our standard of living. More importantly, Morrison and Associates would be required to implement comprehensive anti-discrimination policies and provide regular training to all employees. But the most satisfying part of the settlement was the public apology. David Morrison was required to make a public statement acknowledging that the company had discriminated against me and that such behavior was unacceptable. The press conference was held on a cold December morning. David stood at a podium in the lobby of Morrison and Associates, flanked by his attorneys and looking like he had aged 10 years. His statement was brief but clear. Morrison and Associates acknowledges that we made serious errors in judgment regarding the termination of Jessica Turner. We recognize that our actions constituted pregnancy discrimination, and we deeply regret the harm we caused to Ms. Turner and her family. We are committed to ensuring that such discrimination never occurs again in our workplace. I watched the press conference from my living room, my hand resting on my growing belly. My baby was due in just 2 months, and I was finally at peace with what had happened. The settlement would allow me to focus on motherhood without financial worry, and I knew that my fight had made a difference for other women who might face similar discrimination. The impact of the case extended far beyond Morrison and Associates. The settlement amount made headlines in employment law journals, and the case became a cautionary tale for companies across the country. Human resources departments began reviewing their policies and training programs, afraid of facing similar lawsuits. Catherine received dozens of calls from women who had faced pregnancy discrimination at their workplaces. Many of them had previously been afraid to speak up, but my case had given them the courage to fight back. 3 class action lawsuits were filed against major corporations in the months following my settlement, all citing my case as precedent. David Morrison resigned as CEO of Morrison and Associates 6 months after the settlement. The company's board of directors announced that they were bringing in new leadership to restore the firm's reputation and rebuild its client base. Patricia Wells was also terminated, ending her career in human resources. My daughter was born in February, healthy and beautiful. As I held her in my arms for the first time, I thought about the fight I had waged for her future. I had refused to let them silence me, and in doing so, I had helped create a world where she would be less likely to face the same discrimination I had experienced. The money from the settlement allowed me to take a full year off to bond with my daughter. When I was ready to return to work, I had multiple job offers from companies that had heard about my case and wanted to demonstrate their commitment to treating employees fairly. I chose to work for a consulting firm that specialized in helping companies develop anti-discrimination policies. It was the perfect way to turn my negative experience into something positive. I helped other organizations avoid the mistakes that Morrison and Associates had made, and I became an advocate for pregnant women in the workplace. 3 years later, I was invited to speak at a conference on workplace discrimination. The audience was filled with human resources professionals, employment attorneys, and women's rights advocates. As I stood at the podium, I reflected on the journey that had brought me there. They thought they could fire me for being pregnant and I would just go away quietly, I told the audience. They thought wrong. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be silenced. The case had a lasting impact on employment law. Several states strengthened their pregnancy discrimination statutes in response to high-profile cases like mine. The federal government also increased enforcement of existing laws, conducting more investigations of companies suspected of discriminating against pregnant employees. Morrison and Associates never fully recovered from the scandal. The company was sold to a larger firm 2 years after the settlement, and the Morrison name was quietly retired. The building that had once housed their headquarters was converted to condominiums, erasing the last physical reminder of the company that had tried to destroy my career. But the lessons learned from my case lived on. Business schools began teaching it as an example of how not to handle pregnancy discrimination. The settlement amount became a benchmark for similar cases, and attorneys across the country used it to negotiate better outcomes for their clients. I kept in touch with Maria Santos, the colleague who had provided the crucial testimony that broke the case open. She had left Morrison and Associates shortly after the settlement was announced, fearing retaliation despite the legal protections in place. She found a new job with a company that valued her integrity and courage. "I'm so glad I spoke up," she told me during one of our coffee meetings. "I couldn't live with myself if I had stayed silent and let them get away with what they did to you." The other women who had come forward with their own stories of discrimination at Morrison and Associates also found new opportunities. Catherine helped several of them pursue their own cases, and all received significant settlements. The company's pattern of discrimination was finally exposed and punished. Catherine and I developed a close friendship that went beyond our professional relationship. She became a mentor and advocate, helping me navigate the complex world of employment law and workplace advocacy. She often said that my case was one of the most satisfying victories of her career. "You never gave up," she told me. "Even when they tried to intimidate you, even when they tried to discredit you, you kept fighting. That's what made the difference." As my daughter grew older, I began to think about the lessons I would teach her about standing up for herself and fighting for what's right. I wanted her to understand that sometimes the most important battles are the ones that benefit not just ourselves, but everyone who comes after us. The case also had a profound impact on my marriage. Michael had been supportive throughout the entire ordeal, but the stress of the lawsuit and the media attention had taken its toll. We attended counseling to work through the trauma and emerged stronger than ever. He often said that he had never been more proud of me than during those dark months when I refused to back down. "You turned the worst thing that happened to us into something that made a real difference," he told me. "You changed the world for our daughter and for women everywhere." The financial security provided by the settlement allowed us to make choices we never could have made before. We bought a house in a better school district, started college funds for our daughter, and even took vacations that we had only dreamed about. But, more importantly, I had the freedom to pursue work that was meaningful to me, rather than just taking any job to pay the bills. I also became involved in mentoring young women who were entering the workforce. I spoke at universities and professional organizations, sharing my story and encouraging others to know their rights and speak up when they encountered discrimination. Many of the women I mentored went on to become leaders in their fields, and they often credited our conversations with giving them the confidence to pursue their goals. The legal precedent set by my case was cited in dozens of other discrimination lawsuits. Employment attorneys across the country used it to argue for stronger penalties against companies that discriminated against pregnant employees. The case became required reading in many law schools, and it was featured in several academic papers on workplace discrimination. 5 years after the settlement, I was contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell the story of my case. The documentary, titled "Fighting Back: One Woman's Battle Against Pregnancy Discrimination," won several awards and was shown at film festivals across the country. It brought renewed attention to the issue of workplace discrimination and inspired other women to share their stories. The documentary also led to a book deal. I worked with a ghostwriter to tell my story in detail, and the book became a bestseller in the business and women's rights categories. The proceeds from the book went to a foundation I established to help women who couldn't afford legal representation in discrimination cases. Morrison and Associates became a cautionary tale that was studied in business schools and corporate training programs. The company's downfall was attributed directly to their discriminatory practices and their failure to properly handle my case. It became a textbook example of how a single act of discrimination could destroy a company's reputation and financial stability. The case also had implications for the insurance industry. Employment practices liability insurance became more expensive for companies with poor track records on discrimination, and insurers began requiring more comprehensive anti-discrimination policies and training programs as a condition of coverage. 10 years after my termination, I was invited to speak at Morrison and Associates' former headquarters, which had been converted into a conference center. The irony wasn't lost on me as I stood in the same building where I had been fired, now addressing an audience of human resources professionals about the importance of preventing pregnancy discrimination. This building represents both the worst and best of corporate America, I told the audience. It was here that I experienced the devastating impact of discrimination. But it was also here that I began the fight that would ultimately protect countless other women from the same fate. The speech was emotional for me, but it was also liberating. I had returned to the scene of my greatest professional trauma as a successful advocate and author. The company that had tried to destroy me was gone, but I was still standing, still fighting, still making a difference. My daughter is now a teenager, and she has grown up hearing the story of how her mother fought back against discrimination. She understands that her birth was not just a personal joy, but also a catalyst for change. She has expressed interest in studying law, and I couldn't be more proud of her desire to continue fighting for justice. The case also led to changes in my own family's approach to employment. Both Michael and I became more involved in our company's diversity and inclusion efforts. We made sure that our employers had strong anti-discrimination policies, and we spoke up when we saw behavior that could lead to legal problems. Looking back on those dark days after my termination, I'm amazed at how much my life has changed. What started as the worst professional experience of my life became the foundation for a career dedicated to helping others and creating positive change. The settlement money was important, but the real victory was proving that discrimination wouldn't be tolerated and that companies would be held accountable for their actions. The case continues to be relevant today, as pregnancy discrimination remains a persistent problem in many workplaces. But thanks to cases like mine, women are more aware of their rights and more willing to fight back when they face discrimination. The legal precedents established by my case and others like it have made it easier for women to pursue justice when they are treated unfairly. Catherine often tells me that my case was a turning point in her career. It reinforced her belief that individual acts of courage could create systemic change. She has since taken on several other high-profile discrimination cases, always with the same determination and commitment to justice that she brought to my case. Every case matters, she tells her young associates. Every woman who stands up and fights back makes it easier for the next woman to do the same. That's how change happens, one case at a time. The story of my fight against Morrison and Associates has become part of the broader narrative of women's rights in the workplace. It stands as proof that even when the odds seem overwhelming, justice can prevail. It demonstrates that sometimes the best response to discrimination is not to suffer in silence, but to fight back with everything you have. As I sit in my home office today, working on cases that help other women navigate workplace discrimination, I often think about that Tuesday morning when I walked into David Morrison's office to share the news of my pregnancy. I had no idea that moment would change my life so dramatically, but I'm grateful for every twist and turn the journey has taken. They thought they could fire me for being pregnant and I would disappear quietly. They thought wrong. Instead, I turned their act of discrimination into a platform for change, a source of strength, and ultimately, a victory, not just for me, but for women everywhere who refuse to accept unfair treatment in the workplace. The fight continues, but I'm no longer fighting alone. I'm part of a movement of women who are standing up, speaking out, and demanding better. And that, perhaps, is the sweetest revenge of all.